The word Holocaust was historically used to describe a sacrificial offering burned on an altar. Since 1945, the word has taken on a new and horrible meaning: the mass murder of some 6 million European Jews, as well as members of some other persecuted groups, such as gypsies and homosexuals, by the German Nazi regime during the Second World War. To the anti-Semitic Nazi leader Adolf Hitler, Jews were an inferior race, an alien threat to German racial purity and community. After years of Nazi rule in Germany, during which Jews were consistently persecuted, Hitler's final solution, known as the Holocaust, came to fruition under the cover of World War, with mass killing centers constructed in the concentration camps. Beginning in late 1941, the Germans began mass transports from the ghettos in Poland to the concentration camps, starting with those people viewed as the least useful: the sick, old, weak, and the very young. German forces had begun evacuating many of the death camps in the fall of 1944, sending inmates under guard to march further from the advancing enemy's front line. These so-called death marches continued all the way up to the German surrender, resulting in the deaths of some 250,000 to 375,000 people. In his classic book, Survival in Auschwitz, the Italian Jewish author Primo Levi described his own state of mind, as well as that of his fellow inmates in Auschwitz on the day before Soviet troops arrived at the camp in January 1945. American scientists, many of them refugees from fascist regimes in Europe, took steps in 1939 to organize a project to exploit the newly recognized fission process for military purposes. Only one method was available for the production of the fissionable material, plutonium-239. It was developed at the Metallurgical Laboratory of the University of Chicago under direction of Arthur Holly Compton, and involved the transmutation in a reaction pile of uranium-239. In December 1942, Fermi finally succeeded in producing and controlling a fission chain reaction in this reactor pile at Chicago. The first atomic bomb to be used in warfare used uranium. It was dropped by the United States on Hiroshima, Japan, on August 6, 1945. The explosion, which had the force of more than 15,000 tons of TNT, instantly and completely devastated 11.4 square kilometers of the heart of the city of 343,000 inhabitants. Of this number, some 70,000 were killed immediately, and by the end of the year, the death toll had surpassed 100,000. More than 67% of the city's structures were destroyed or damaged. The next atomic bomb to be exploded was the plutonium type. It was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, producing a blast equal to 21,000 tons of TNT. The terrain and small size of Nagasaki reduced destruction of life and property, but 39,000 persons were killed and 25,000 injured. About 40% of the city's structures were destroyed or seriously damaged. The Japanese initiated surrender negotiations.
The Cold War was a state of tension that began in 1947 and ended in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart. Harry Truman was the president of the United States at the time, and Mikhail Gorbachev was the leader of the USSR. The term Cold War came about because there was no actual fighting involved. The first part of this war started 2 years after World War II had ended. The USSR took over the Eastern Bloc, and this led to the US using the concept of containment, which was meant to keep communism from expanding. The US also provided aid to Western European countries. The NATO alliance was then formed. The Berlin Wall was constructed on August 13, 1961, and many people faced food shortages, and so the US had sent supplies to those in need using the Berlin Airlift. After the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, a new era began, which caused the Sino-Soviet split, and this made a complicated relationship within the communist world. During the early 1980s, there was more tension, and this caused the US to increase diplomatic, military, and economic pressure on the USSR. The Soviet Union was already experiencing economic stagnation, which lasted 21 years. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev presented reforms such as perestroika and glasnost, perestroika meaning reorganization and glasnost meaning openness. The Berlin Wall was then destroyed on November 9, 1989. Many people celebrated the fall of the Berlin Wall due to the fact that they are no longer divided west and east. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union had lost power and was then banned in August 1991. The fall of the USSR also led other communist regimes to wither away, such as Mongolia, Cambodia, and South Yemen. The United States then remained as the only superpower in the world.
Rosa Parks is a woman who inspired many people. Her quiet, courageous act changed America. During the 1950s, whites had more of an advantage than the colored people. There was a time in 1955 where white people would sit in front of the bus while colored people had to sit in the back. But that day has changed on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks sat in front of the bus and refused to give up her seat to a white man. When she refused to give up her seat, she later then was arrested and triggered a war of protest in December 5th, 1955. Many people were outraged, and after Rosa Parks' arrest, people of Montgomery organized a boycott where no blacks would ride the buses, and this lasted for about 381 days. They also did sit-ins, eat-ins, and similar causes. There were many people who joined the protests to demand equal rights for everyone, especially for Rosa Parks. They all believed that this wasn't fair and everyone should be treated equally. The 13th-month mass protest ended with the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that segregation on public buses is unconstitutional. The governor of Georgia, Herman Talmadge, believed that white children should be kept in white schools and that colored children should be kept in colored schools. There were some people who agreed with Governor Herman, but others disagreed. After a year, about 500 schools desegregated their classrooms. This allowed colored and white people to go to school together. In September 1957, 9 African American students volunteered to integrate Little Rock's Central High School. Many of the whites were outraged. Many of the African Americans were harassed by other students. Eisenhower then realized he needed to do something. He hired the National Guard and ordered 1,000 paratroopers into Little Rock. Towards the end of the year, they shut down Central High rather than let integration continue. On September 9, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. This law gave the Attorney General greater power over school desegregation.
Let me ask you a question. Are you afraid of those Nazis? Do you not want them near you? Do you not want them hurting your children or taking them away? Well, we have an easy solution. Today we have Nazi Away. It's the spray that instantly gets rid of Nazis. If they get anywhere near you, well, you just spray them and they're gone. It's like magic. The price is 4 payments of $99.99, and there's one slight side effect, and I'm afraid that's death. Thank you.
U.S. intervention in Vietnam began when Ho Chi Minh rose to power and led the Vietnamese to independence by achieving communism. The Vietnamese wanted their independence from France, causing conflict, and, after France had given up, caused the U.S. to intervene from fear of domino theory and contain the spread of communism. Many U.S. citizens were drafted and called into Vietnam to fight, which saw much U.S. public support and little opposition. The fighting took place in dense jungles within Vietnam, and troops carried out search and destroy missions while using Agent Orange or napalm to destroy the jungles to better fight within the terrain. As the Vietnam War carried on, U.S. support for the war began to decrease as inflation and funding became a bigger problem. Many citizens also saw the fighting through televisions, and the growing credibility gap also hurt the support for the war. As the Vietnam War continued, the U.S. saw a divide between its citizens, with hawks supporting while doves were against the conflict. The Tet Offensive on January 30th, 1968, caused support to drop drastically as many Americans began to see the outcome of the war draw closer to a stalemate. Richard Nixon was elected in 1969, who took advantage of the Vietnam War and its dwindling support for his own campaign and proposed his plan for Vietnamization. Vietnamization involved the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam, allowing for many people serving to finally return home. Despite the efforts of the U.S., communism became victorious in Vietnam as Saigon had been invaded by North Vietnamese forces.
Now we'll talk about the Nixon administration. Nixon wanted to decrease the size and influence of the federal government, So he introduced a plan known as New Federalism. This plan distributed federal power to state and local governments. In 1969, Nixon advocated the Family Assistance Plan. This meant that every family of four, with no source of income, would receive $1,600 a year, with a possibility of earning up to $4,000 a year in supplemental income. Since we're on the topic of President Nixon, we'll talk about the Watergate scandal. At 2:30 a.m. on June 17, 1972, 5 men broke into the campaign headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, or the DNC. Burglars planned to photograph documents outlining the Democratic Party strategy and place wiretaps on phones. The leader of the burglar group was James McCord, a former CIA agent. He led the group of the president's advisors to the DNC. When the cover-up began, Nixon immediately denied having any involvement with it. However, as it was later discovered, the president was deeply involved. He sent some of his advisors. Key to properly obtaining evidence was getting the tapes. As revealed by Alexander Butterfield, Nixon taped all of his conversations with his advisors. A year-long battle for the tapes, dubbed the Nixon tapes, followed. The Saturday Night Massacre then occurred. This was when Elliot Richardson resigned after he refused to fire Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor for the Watergate scandal. On August 5th, Nixon handed the tapes over. When the tapes were obtained, the House Judiciary Committee wanted to impeach Nixon. However, Nixon soon resigned as president on August 8, 1974. This was before the House could vote on articles of impeachment.
Through the 1960s and 1970s, the New Right group emerged, which had promoted conservative ideas and actions seeking to preserve traditional values. The New Right focused on social issues such as abortions and equal rights amendment, usually blocking or opposing them. Christianity had played a big role, seen as the moral majority in the ideology and mindset of conservatives, usually determining whether something was right or wrong according to the religion and mostly opposing liberal ideas. Ronald Reagan and the problems he brought up appealed to conservatives, which led to his election against Jimmy Carter in 1980. After the 1980s election, Ronald Reagan began his attempts at improving the U.S. economy. Reagan introduced economic policies known as Reaganomics, which included budget cuts, tax cuts, and increased defense spending. Reagan reduced the spending of the federal government, which reduced the spending on social programs, which would later hurt programs such as food stamps, welfare benefits, and student loans. Reagan also believed that by reducing taxes, people could divert their money into businesses, improving productivity, improving inflation, and overall stimulating more activity within the economy. Lastly, Reagan increased spending on defense, which hurt the cuts from social programs. The economy saw an improvement as many citizens began to spend more money from tax cuts. However, the improvement was short-lived as debts began to rise, the rich had benefited while the poor were hurt from Reagan's economic actions.
McDonald's Happy Meal. That's a regular hamburger.
A regular size fries.
A regular size soft drink.
And a McDonald's plain cookie sampler.
McDonald's Happy Meals. And there's more.
Hey, look. Animals. Look at the funny whale.
Now a look book in every McDonald's Happy Meal. Animals that fly, cats in the wild, animals of the sea, and the biggest animals too. You can collect all 4. Look books now in McDonald's Happy Meal.